I think it's such a shame that here in the Philippines, we are not taught so much about our own Southeast Asian neighbors. We don't know much about their history, culture, politics, style of government. We don't know much about what's going on over there right now today. We don't see it on the news. It's really a shame because I think so much of their histories, their lives affect us in ways we don't really quite understand. I think that perhaps the missing link in understanding Philippine history is looking at the history of our neighbors because we actually have so many things in common that it's shocking that we don't think of it in a regional sense. When we don't think of history in a broader perspective than just the Philippines. I think that when we think of like, well, how can we fix the Philippines? Who are the best leaders of the Philippines? What can we do? What do we do with politics? So much of our problems are not just the problems in the Philippines. There are problems in Thailand. There are problems in Malaysia. Problems in Indonesia, and so perhaps if we look at how other countries have been able to deal with their issues, we'd also have a better sense of how we can deal with ours. We can see what else has been tried. We can see what ways of protest or ways of regime change or ways of dealing with leaders who are involved with corruption. Perhaps if we look at what other people are doing, we'd have a better sense again of what we should do or what we can do better. Over the past year, I've been reading lots of world history and Philippine history, and more recently, Southeast Asian history specifically, and there's so much in common amongst us. We all know that before Europeans colonized this part of the world, there was general trade amongst the different parts of Southeast Asia. The Philippines was actually quite isolated in the pre-colonial times because while we did have trade with China and Malaysia and Vietnam, at least the parts of are today called those countries, we were actually apart from Mindanao, parts of Mindanao and Sulu, we were actually isolated from a lot of the empires pre-Spanish colonization. We were not part of many of these giant empires, like say the Majapahit Empire or the Srivijaya Empire, these Mandala polities that really took over huge parts of Southeast Asia. We were not most of like Luzon or Visayas were not a part of these empires, and so some of their culture was not able to come to us in a way that would have happened if they had this very unifying empire taking over. But there are some aspects of Philippine language that we get from the Malay language, and some people even say back in the day that they'd say that the Filipinos are an extension of the Malay race. And actually, what a fun fact, I learned this yesterday. In the 60s, I think under just Dado Macapagal possibly, they even had this thing and they wanted them to do like a union of sorts, a non-political union comprised of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines called Mafilindo. Because it would, Mafilindo, because again, we were all like the Malay races. It didn't really turn out well. But anyway, so we were not part of these major empires, but we did have lots of trade with other parts of Southeast Asia. And we had a similar relationship with China because we were all trading with southern China. Where we get lots of commonality comes during the European colonization era of sorts. Southeast Asia can be separated into mainland Southeast Asia, which goes from Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and then you have the island Southeast Asia, which has like Indonesia, the Philippines, parts of Malaysia, and during the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, every part of Southeast Asia, apart from Thailand, was colonized by a European power. So the Philippines was colonized by Spain, and Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch. Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore was colonized by the British. The French colonized the Indochina, or what is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. I think Myanmar was colonized by the British and may have been colonized by the French as well. But you can see that every part of Southeast Asia was colonized at some point by one of these European powers. And this is the reason why, for example, in the Philippines, we're the only country that is Catholic, because in the Philippines, Spain really wanted to make sure everyone was Christian, and so there's a lot of friar stuff going on, where no other, country in Southeast Asia had that kind of Christian, push by the colonizers. Anyway, so during this time, we had in common, we were all colonized by different European powers, and we all have a very similar relationship in we were kind of our sense of nationalism was being constructed during the colonization period more so than prior to it, and we were our kind of development of nationalism was disrupted by the Second World War. The Philippines has a specific situation because we had transfer of power from Spain to the U.S., but all of our senses of nationalism was and developing that was disrupted by the Second World War, where we got colonized by Japan, and Japan. Most of Southeast Asia was colonized by the same power, Japan. It was the first time that we were actually all united in a way. We were all united because we were all under Japan, and Japan had this they wanted to create this thing called the Greater East Co-Prosperity Sphere, I think is what it's called. And so for the first time during Japanese colonization, we were actually united as a region. And then when Japan lost the Second World War, we got returned to our previous European colonizers, and during the period from 1945 to 1965, and so forth, various countries of Southeast Asia wanted to get independence. The first was the Philippines, where we got it through agreements with the government in the United States, and other countries through war. But we all share in the sense that, one by one, we all wanted control over our own countries. And so this development of nationalism that would have been required to kind of assert control over the countries happened during this period of time. And it coincided with a global Cold War. So, for those who are unfamiliar with what the Cold War is, it was this thing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s where there were two main ideologies that were actually there's one ideology and one counter ideology that was spreading around the world. That was communism, and that was it was some kind of variation of anti-communism. And so some countries in Southeast Asia got taken over by communist ideology, and some were propped up by anti-communism. There was no real, there were some people, and some countries wanted to be neutral. So like Indonesia technically said they were neutral, and so did Myanmar. During this time, Myanmar got really isolated, and they didn't really do much. They didn't really interact much with the outside. But Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, and Singapore were anti-communist, and then Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos were communist. And so during the Cold War, the major powers were the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, and they did lots of behind the scenes stuff here in Southeast Asia. So, for example, the Soviet Union and China were communists, and so they would at various times in history fund lots of communist groups within each of these countries, whether it's Malaysia or Thailand or the Philippines or Indonesia. They would fund these communist groups that would help overthrow the government. And later on, the Soviet Union and China started fighting over. They were both communists, but they started fighting over control over communism as well within the region. But there was a sense that, the Philippines and Thailand were looked at as American pawns. Malaysia and Singapore were looked at as the British pawns. And Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos were looked at as Soviet pawns. And China had influence in each of these places, but mostly through the militia groups. And so this whole time, in the countries that were saying that they were trying to fight communism, there were a lot of these authoritarian dictatorships that propped up. So in the Philippines, we had Ferdinand Marcos. But what's interesting is actually this was not unique, So Marcos was in the Philippines as a dictator, but there were also many every country in Southeast Asia in the 70s and 80s had an authoritarian at its head. Myanmar had Ne Win, Cambodia had Lon Nol, Pol Pot, Thailand had various military dictatorships, Malaysia in the 80s had Mahathir, Indonesia had Sukarno and Suharto, and kind of so on and so on. But every single country had some kind of dictator or some kind of authoritarian in charge, and often because they said they needed to fight communism. Either that or they were the communists themselves, and they were trying to, there was like the head of the party who was exerting primary control. So during the Cold War, there was a twofold tension in each of these countries, because again they had just freed themselves from European colonization, and now they suddenly, this Cold War happens where they now have to figure out how to make the nation whole in this way, or like homogeneous or culturally intact, because how can you exert nationalism if the nation itself is so, it has so many cracks in it. And so this is the reason why there's so many very intense, violent anti-communist movements, because it's very difficult. When the Europeans left, now suddenly it was like a free for all of sorts. Now there were different parties wanted to have power, different ideologies were coming forth, and it was just a big mess in Southeast Asia from the 60s to the 80s. Big mess in Southeast Asia. So after the 80s and 90s, when the Cold War finally ended, and they formed ASEAN. ASEAN originally was made up of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines, the 5 original nations. The 6th one was Brunei, and then Vietnam, and then they added more in the 90s. But the Cold War really disrupted the relationships between countries in Southeast Asia, because Vietnam and Indochina was specifically quite against the rest of the Southeast Asia, because the rest of Southeast Asia was looked at as, like, again, pawns from the West, while Vietnam was trying to just assert their own power as well and expand through Cambodia and Laos, and possibly even into Thailand. But anyway, so now the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union is dissolved, ASEAN kind of brings everyone together in the 90s, and then it's the 2000s. Different parts of Southeast Asia are doing better than others, but all of them have been very politically unstable, because even though in most of these countries the communist threat has been abated, apart from the Philippines, we still have lots of communist stuff going on, communist and anti-communist stuff in the news a lot. For the most part, communists died in other parts of the Southeast Asia, but they still had lots of local movements that were anti-government, whether they were from people who wanted to because of the way in which Southeast Asia, because again, if you look back again, when the Europeans colonized Southeast Asia, they arbitrarily really created the borders, and so when that arbitrary country suddenly had the ability to be freed from European colonization, not everyone in that country felt united. Some people felt they had their own specific culture they wanted to uphold. Some people felt they were being oppressed by whoever was at the center of power within the country. There were many parts of these, like, now very messy, like, countries that wanted to be free of the center of power. And so in the past 20-30 years especially, there's lots of, like, local, as described by the local government's terrorism, but local movements, insurgency movements that have been trying to assert power within their own regions and promoting their own cultures, that every country in Southeast Asia has been dealing with. And so because of this, we're all in the same boat, where we had a similar transition from no colonization, arbitrarily drawing lines and creating countries, suddenly having a war, and then having the Cold War, and then suddenly having to have a very weak sense of nationalism and trying to figure out a way to bring everyone together and feel like they have control over their lives. Some countries are doing better than others. I forgot one of the authoritarians, of course, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. But every country is trying to do their best, and it's very messy. If you look at the political histories of Myanmar, you just saw recently Myanmar had a military coup. Look at Thailand, they just had a military coup not too long ago. Malaysia is in a big political mess right now. The Philippines, we'll see how the elections go. We're anticipating it through these videos, but it's not the bright situation. But I think that if we look at how each of these countries have been dealing with this, maybe the answer is actually to work together. We're all suffering through very similar circumstances, although we have different religions. Malaysia and Indonesia are Muslim, and like Thailand is Buddhist, and we're Christian. But beyond all of that, we have very similar political problems. And I think if we look at how each country is figuring things out, I think we can figure out a way that we can all benefit in the longer run. I want to make future videos on Southeast Asia as well. It's very interesting, But I hope you learned something, and I hope you, after this video, you try to look up other countries in Southeast Asia because they are quite good.